with the same minute care with which we scholars were treating the ancient. My presentation today is an attempt to bring these two worlds together and to give an account of his work at the site Antinopolis and its legacy, only part of which can be appreciated to the present due to the history of the collection and its uneven publication. By the time he arrived at Antinopolis, Johnson knew Egypt fairly well. After obtaining his first and second degrees at Oxford, he was selected for the Egyptian civil service in 1914, and he continued at Oxford for another year in order to study Arabic. He spent 2 years in the Egyptian civil service, gaining a practical knowledge on the ground and administrative experience. With limited opportunities for advancement, he resigned in 1907 and returned to Oxford, where he studied petrology with Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt. The following year, in 1908, Johnson returned to Egypt with Hunt, and in 1909-1910, on Hunt's recommendation, Johnson received his first commission by the Egypt Exploration Fund to work with Blackman in a concession that spanned the west bank of the Nile from Banassa to Sidmani el-Gebel. They tested and abandoned several Middle Kingdom and New Kingdom cemeteries with only limited success, discovering the Ptolemaic cemeteries they had hoped for. They were looking for human mummy cartonnage made of recycled papyrus. In 1889, Flinders Petrie had discovered that human mummy cartonnage from the Ptolemaic period often contained reused papyri bearing text. Johnson's teachers, Grenfell and Hunt, had exploited this source in cemeteries in the Fayum, in the Greco-Roman branch of the EEF, saw a similar windfall from cemeteries in Middle Egypt. Having proven his abilities in the field, Johnson set out on behalf of the Egypt Exploration Fund in 2 successive winters, 1911 and 1912, to continue the search for papyri in the cemeteries of Middle Egypt. In 1911, Johnson worked at Atfi on the east bank of the Nile, opposite Meidum, returning with some papyrus cartonnage and some portrait masks, as seen here. The following year, in 1912, Johnson returned to Atfi, but had to leave 2 weeks after he began working as the result of some unspecified difficulty, and he spent the remainder of the season in cemeteries along the western desert south of Oxyrhynchus. Although these expeditions were determined to be of little worth at the time due to the dearth of papyri, their extensive photographic documentation, now in the Griffith Institute, Oxford, is today a valuable resource. The images, now mixed with Johnson's 1913-1914 season, depict a wide range of Ptolemaic, Roman, and earlier burials in situ, only a handful of which you see here. It was the perceived failure of 2 seasons spent seeking papyri from mummy cartonnage that precipitated a return to the rubbish mounds so well exploited by Grenfell and Hunt at Oxyrhynchus. This time, the target was ancient Antinopolis, or, as common in EEF and contemporary usage, Antinoe. In November 14, 1913, the announcement of the EEF Antinoe season is almost apologetic in tone. For the Greco-Roman branch, Mr. Johnson will undertake work at a new site for which has been assigned to us by Mr. Maspero, that of ancient Antinoe. This site, this season, will be somewhat experimental, but important papyri have come from the site in the past, and there's no reason to suppose that it has been exhausted. It'd be silly to try to say this to the Italian mission, who has now worked there for nearly 80 years with great success. So Johnson arrived on the 9th of December 1913 and began working within the city wall, targeting every promising trash dump, which he indicated by using a simplified rendering of the description de l'Egypte map you see here. On Johnson's map, each letter indicates a massive mound of ancient refuse that had piled high on the city's edges. And just to orient us, and they'll be very small, and I'm sorry about that, but here are some of the images of the city's landmarks located on the map. This is an enormous site spanning 1.5 kilometers north to south, just within the walls. From the bottom left is a Ramesside temple. At top left is the so-called Isis temple near the east gate. At top right is the hippodrome. At bottom right is what remained of the theater at the time, and in the middle is was the location of the excavators' tents, located just south of the wadi that bisects the city. The ancient paved streets demarcated on the map were, and to some extent are, discernible on the ground. In addition to the temples and churches and other public buildings, the great majority of structures are mud brick houses, the remains of which you see here. Johnson arrived with some 24 men from Fayum who had worked previously at Oxyrhynchus. The method of excavation, which Johnson is at pains to describe, in his post-excavation report, built on that developed by Grenfell and Hunt, wherein mounds containing strata of earth and organic matter were identified as likely candidates before gangs of workmen cut a section of a given mound. The resulting trench was bound by a high wall of the mound in the front and a low retaining wall at the rear, over which the contents of the trench were thrown. Thus, strata of papyri might be visibly identified and further investigated, but without risk of collapsing, such as was often the case with the steep faces carved by men digging for sebach, which were prone to crumble and bury men alive. Work began at Mound C, located east of the theater at the southern limit of the ancient city, but finding late, that is Byzantine papyri, Johnson opted to begin excavation at the northern half of the ancient city across Wadi Abada in the hope of discovering earlier Roman period papyri. And here he concentrated on several widely distributed mounds, and doubling the number of workmen with local recruits, he moved to Mound M, where he achieved his greatest success, discovering what he identified at the time as a small Byzantine library containing fragments of the Iliad, the Odyssey, Theocritus, Euripides, fragments of commentary, history, theology, grammar, and medicine, including the Latin alphabet with letter names spelled out in Greek, and the illustrated botanical text, both shown here, and a few documentary texts as well. Moving to the adjacent Mound N, numerous Byzantine fragments, more Coptic than Greek, and blank papyri were discovered over 12 days of excavation. Discoveries included the famous illustrated manuscript fragment of the Charioteers seen here, a fragment of Xenophon's Symposium, a magical text, educational and documentary texts, such as the Acknowledgement of Debt, also shown here, dating to 542. And a fragment of leather inscribed with Hebrew. Johnson moved back over Wadi Abada to the mounds to the south part of the city again with the entire gang of workmen after a preliminary inspection of G, indicating the potential for relatively early or 4th century papyri, having determined that the southern part of the city must indeed be older than the older half after all, and hoping to find as much early papyri as possible before the end of the season, he doubled the number of workmen working mounds E, F to the south of G. At the same time, workmen returned to Mound Z at the north gate of the ancient city, retrieving a fragment of the Iliad, a handful of Greek documents, in addition to a complete page of a Coptic codex. The new workmen, having been trained up and following 7 days, the following 7 days were concentrated on Mound G, which yielded a 200 to 300 line 4th century Iliad, a fragment of comedy, a grammar, and several documents. Working several other mounds with limited success, he closed excavations on the 7th of February. Following Grenfell and Hunt's methodology, which in turn had been influenced by Petrie, Johnson used photography to document the landscape, excavation in progress, papyri, and other finds such as you've seen so far. He also photographed objects arranged by material and other typologies. Even more so than papyri, the general find spots of these objects can rarely be identified, and we cannot associate them with their find spot, but only conclude that they too derived from rubbish mounds or were surface finds. And we see here a few stone inscriptions, wood, metal keys and locks, ceramics, worked bone basketry, and brushes. The trash heaps also yielded all manner of discarded fragments of garments, worn out footgear, shoes, sandals, and socks, never a pair, as seen at the lower left, headgear, caps, and women's hairnets as seen at the bottom center, and other accessories like the bag seen at the lower right. Such objects give personality and texture to the stone and mud brick remains, architecture, visible in the photographs, and also returned to them. After excavation,